Good afternoon. My name is John Shibley. I'm the chairman and CEO of Quantum FinTech Holdings Corporation. I want to speak about the looming currency disorder that we're going to be facing as things migrate and move forward. I do want to start, though, with a little history and share with you some of the things that I've accomplished. Hopefully that will prove out my bona fides. Hopefully it'll show you that I have some idea of where I think things are going. I don't know for sure. In 1994, I started a company called NextTrade. NextTrade was one of the first SEC-approved electronic communications networks, which in the United States was the functional equivalent of a stock exchange. At NextTrade, we really focused on being faster. I mean, we were probably the first high-frequency trading shop on the street, where we were always worried about how do we get our orders to the national best bidder offer faster than our competition, and NextTrade worked well for us. I ran that company until 2006 and sold it to Citigroup. In 1998, I started a company called Matchbook FX. Matchbook FX was one of the first electronic communications networks for foreign currencies. We really disintermediated a lot of the liquidity providers. We were one of the first foreign currency platforms to empower retail investors to trade directly with big banks. Ran that until 2001 and sold it to a publicly traded company. And then in 2007, we built a clearing and settlement bank, and that was called Andorin Bank, which we actually opened here in Florida. It was one of the first banks to marry brokerage and correspondent clearing, I think, correctly. We ran that for several years and sold it to Valley National Bank. And then we started a bank in the country of Panama called Atlas Bank, and Atlas Bank is operational and live today in Panama as one of the most forward technology-centric clearing and settlement banks, especially in FX, I think, in the region. And then most recently, we started a company called Quantum FinTech Acquisition Company, and that's where Joe reached out to us, asking me to come on and speak about currency disorder. Quantum FinTech was a special purpose acquisition company. We announced that we acquired TradeStation, which is a Miami-based corporation, in a $1.4 billion transaction. Hopefully the SEC blesses that trade soon and we get to move forward with that transaction. And so for my entire professional career, I have been operating in trading and settlement, primarily in equities and FX. And so when I had my options for what to talk about, I liked the idea of speaking towards currency disorder because I think the world as we know it is changing, in particular the world as we know it based entirely on the US dollar, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Where do we stand today as the US dollar? US dollar today represents 88.3% of all foreign currency transactions. It is still far and away the biggest gorilla in the room. We're roughly 59% of currency reserves and 38% of cross-border payments are all done in US dollar. In the last 10 or 15 years, the percent of SWIFT messages that have been done in US dollar has concentrated. According to The Economist, 4/5 of global supply chain trades are done in US dollar. And then finally, the dollar's share of invoicing was 4.7 times larger than America's share of the value of imports. And so I think it is well known that the US dollar is the reserve currency, and I'm afraid that that's going to change, and I'm afraid when that changes, it's really gonna change the way the United States has to operate and really can undermine the value of the US dollar. And I'll go into that some more. Current reserves. Over the last few years, many countries have been increasing their share in current reserves into cash instead of different forms of reserves. As you can see here, foreign exchange today represents about $13 trillion of the current reserves of all of the countries around the world, and the US dollar is the largest segment of that. The US dollar as the preferred reserve currency, its position is eroding. In 1991, 71% of all reserves were in US dollar. We're down to 59%. As you go through all of these listings, you'll see that everything, especially the Chinese renminbi, is moving up where it's now 3%. All of these currencies are becoming more commonly held as reserves. And that's important because the reserve dollar is the functional basis upon the economy that we work on. I love some of these quotes. So when I was asked to do this speech, I started Googling, because Google is the best resource, I guess, for everything. But I like to find things that say what's happening to the US dollar. The US is losing the global race to decide the future of money, and it could doom the almighty dollar. That's pretty powerful words. Saudi Arabia relatively recently was considering doing oil settlement in yuan instead of US dollar. That's kind of a big deal. Jack Dorsey, for whatever you think of him, he's got a goatee like me and a wool cap. Jack Dorsey says Bitcoin will replace the US dollar as the reserve currency. And then we've seen, because of the Russian war in Ukraine, very unique weaponization of sanctions against other forms of currency that I think will help erode the position of the US dollar. So we've got a lot of things that I think can cause currency crisis. In the United States, we have unfunded liabilities that are almost unimaginable, and yet that is the strength of the world system, is the US dollar. We have very recently weaponized all of the SWIFT systems against Russia. We have very recently been sanctioning Russia in a unique way. I'm not going to get into politics as to what's good or bad. I'm just saying that we are exercising the position that we have in a way that has never been done before. And other countries, like Saudi Arabia, are thinking, is it okay for us to be dependent on the US dollar? And then we'll talk a little bit about the rise of crypto. I'm a big fan of central bank digital currencies. I like the direction that's going through. I think we'll talk, how that could affect the position of the US dollar. And then finally, in my mind, the biggest challenge to the US dollar is the rise of China. China's a very real rival, and they're focused on undermining the reserve currency status of the US dollar. Here are our unfunded liabilities, and I think I did this presentation last week. I didn't even know that we could get to $192 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Frankly, it seems fake. But that is the reality, and somehow we've got to pay this $192,000. We've got the federal debt of $29 million, Social Security is almost $60 million, Medicare is $103 million. Every U.S. citizen owes $600,000 in debt. And unfortunately, most U.S. citizens don't have the cash position to cover that. And so the idea that the US dollar deserves to be the reserve currency, I question. And with the debt that's hanging over it, I don't think it can be sustainable. It's been a fascinating thing to watch the war in in Ukraine. Horrible and fascinating. I really am appreciative, though, of what's taken, the steps that have been made to restrict and sanction Russia. Almost half of Russia's total reserve are now frozen, probably more. And that's, I think, economically a bad thing, but from a moral perspective, probably the correct thing. The facts, though, are that Russia's economic and natural resource values are too high to keep locked up. It's just too big of a place for the sanctions to stay in place. Other governments, in particular Saudi Arabia, when they made noise about settling oil in something other than dollar, I hope everybody woke up and kind of said this could be a very significant thing. If we start settling globally in yuan or renminbi instead of US dollar, the dollar's position as the reserve currency can erode very fast. We benefited from the United States. It is interesting because the bank that we run, that we own and we operate is in the country of Panama. And I don't know of any country that suffered the same kind of draconian lockdown that Panama went through. And Panama did a lot of things to survive the COVID crisis that the US didn't have to do. What the US got to do was just print money like it was going out of fashion and give free money away to everybody to try to keep the economy up. That worked for the United States, but it does not work globally. And so what we've seen, I think, in the COVID response is going to further undermine the reserve status of the US dollar. I also want to talk briefly about central bank digital currencies, the way they're evolving, and then the International Monetary Fund has special drawing rights that can act and operate a lot like a reserve currency that they're moving to the chain as well, and I think that can represent a real threat to the US dollar. I don't know if everybody follows crypto or likes crypto or has paid any attention to what central bank digital currencies are, but there are 90 countries now that are exploring central bank digital currencies as a way to replace their functioning currency, whatever it may be. Like cash, a CBDC would be a direct liability of a central bank and does allow for faster, more efficient payments. A CBDC could provide for safer, faster, cheaper payments. It could spur innovation. It'll expand financial inclusion, which is a worthy goal. In almost every material way, the idea that cash is a good way to do currency, I think, is gone. It's now here on this phone, right? Everything in my life almost is on this phone, including every wallet. That's what's going to happen with the central bank digital currencies. As these things evolve, they can become real threats to the current financial system. An interest-bearing central bank digital currency, I think, could replace the US dollar. I actually would argue should replace the US dollar. And I think that will be a good thing for all of us. A successful central bank digital currency could threaten the system as we know it. It could complicate the implementation of monetary policy, which I'm a very big fan of. If we all had access to a immutable, trackable, unmovable currency that someone couldn't just print, I would much rather have that than the US dollar, and I think we're eventually moving in that direction. And then finally, every business that I've built, I shared my history from NextTrade to Matchbook to Andorin. I built banks and I built brokerage firms. I built all of these systems, and they've all been incredibly highly regulated companies. And I live in absolute terror of any three-letter agency from the United States. You can name it IRS, SEC, FBI, I don't care, DOJ. I don't want to hear any of those letters in my mind because I'm paranoid of those things. This system, this central bank digital currency, will be the greatest police function, and maybe we feel differently about that, but it'll be the greatest police function. So in my mind, I think a central bank digital currency is an inevitability. Whether or not it'll be the US that leads or China, I think is to be determined. So here's where we stand today with central bank digital currencies. These are two different reports that I've pulled up and kind of mashed together, and I apologize, my graphics aren't very good. But we've got over 90 central bank digital currencies that have been launched. About 14 of them have collapsed, but the others are all either in a launch phase or a pilot phase or a research phase. And I think it's an important thing to think about. Central bank digital currencies, having a cryptocurrency backed by your central bank could be a remarkable thing. So we've got a couple of different things that worry me, right? We've got the unfunded liabilities, I think is going to erode the US dollar. We've got sanctions against Russia, which I think is problematic. We've got monetary policies from the United States that I think are problematic. But for me, the biggest thing that I think will cause some kind of currency crisis is the rise of China. I did all of this research in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I was shocked at what I found. I did not know that in 1980, China had $420 billion in GDP, and then in 2020, it had $14.6 trillion. I did not know that in 2025, China will be 33% larger in terms of domestic gross product than the United States. I find that absolutely shocking. There's no question in my mind that an economic powerhouse like this can challenge the US dollar status as a reserve currency. This came from a report by Lawrence Summers. Mr. Summers he's been at the SEC, he's been all over the place, he's very famous for some of his work in economics. I loved the picture. When you see this guy from 1940 saying, we're going to lift China up and up and up until China is like Kansas City, and then you look at it today, Shanghai versus Kansas City, it challenges our normalcy bias. We need to be ready for China to be the largest economic force in the world and perhaps the reserve currency. This is the Fortune 500 companies. Another piece of data that I pulled up that really grabbed me. I just kind of imagined that the supermajority of companies in the Fortune 500 would be US companies. But as you can see in 2020, the number of Fortune 500 companies that are Chinese US companies is now greater than the number of US companies. China lends money everywhere, right? I don't know how well you can see the slide, but there's 4 different categories where you're up to 1% of GDP, then 1 to 5%, 5 to 15%, and 15 to 69% of GDP is money that is owed to China. If these countries own 15% of their GDP to China, how easy would it be for China to force them to settle in renminbi or yuan? It would be very easy. The United States owes somewhere between 5 and 15% of its GDP to China. China lends money to everyone, and they are going to be uniquely positioned to command a new currency system. In addition to China growing as fast as it's growing, and in addition to China blending money, China has really kicked butt in putting together a central bank digital currency. I don't know if everybody watched the Olympics, but they used that as a test bed to launch their cryptocurrency central bank coin and get everybody to spend in that way. And it is a more efficient system. It is a more transparent system. I think from the Chinese perspective, and also probably from the US regulatory perspective, it is a much easier tool to police and track and find and extract tax money off of, right? So when I think about where we stand in the United States with all of the unfunded liabilities that we have, with the way that we've abused the Federal Reserve System to print money, with the way that we have weaponized sanctions against Russia and scared other countries thinking, God, what happens if they kick us off of SWIFT? And then finally, I think about the idea of a country as powerful and amazing as China putting together its own central bank digital currency. I do think, in fact, that the reserve status of the US dollar can and will be threatened, and I think that'll cause a lot of volatility, and I think that will result in even crazier action than we see today in cryptos. We'll see even crazier actions in renminbi and yuan and US dollar, but I think it's a very, very real threat. So I'm going to wrap up basically with that. I guess the last point that I do want to touch on, and it's kind of a weird point, but I have had the fortune of building a couple of different banks, and when we first built our banks, almost every core processor for banks that we did diligence on, almost every single one, this was 2007, resolved only down to the US dollar. By the time we were building our bank in Panama in 2010, there were 2 or 3 core processors for banks that resolved into multiple currencies. Today, many bank core processors resolve down to whatever you want, euro, yuan, renminbi, whatever it is, you can resolve down to. And so I think there's a lot of things that have changed internal to the market structure of banks and currencies that can lead to the removal of the US dollar as US currency. So I think, as a reserve currency. So I think what I wanted to try to communicate is that the idea that the US dollar will remain the absolute dominant 88% currency transaction base is not plausible. I think it's almost inevitable that the yuan will come up. I think cryptocurrencies will come up. And I think that we will find much greater volatility in all things related to the US dollar. And I guess with that, I'll just wrap. And thank you, guys.